Welcome to Breaking the News Plus on this Friday night. My guest this evening is Eric Roper. He is a news columnist for the Star Tribune, writes about really all things, it seems, Minneapolis as of late. And about a week ago, a column of his caught my eye, and it was about Minneapolis public schools. And here's the title for those that didn't read it. Minneapolis Public Schools doom loop is a threat to the city's future. Eric Roper, welcome to Breaking the News Plus.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so what does that mean? The doom loop of the Minneapolis public schools threatening the entire city's future?
So first of all, about the loop, right? What we have, for a number of years, we've heard a lot of news, bad news coming out of Minneapolis public schools. But during the pandemic, there were pandemic relief funds that could prop things up. Those have dried up. Now we're in a situation where they have a $50 million shortfall, and they're having to make up for it in part by cutting services. When you cut services, you lose enrollment, and they have the shortfall to begin with because they're losing enrollment. And so you can sort of get the idea that this sort of feeds on itself. It's a loop. And the enrollment of Minneapolis public schools has been declining. There's been a slight blip in recent years, but just the general trend has been downward since the early 2000s. And at this point, they have about 30,000 students, and they have the capacity in their buildings for about 43,000 students. And that is a pretty big difference, and that is sort of an issue when we think about right-sizing the budget. And so anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but we can talk about any of the specifics.
It absolutely sets the stage. Large urban district. It's no secret that in these United States, large urban districts have struggled across the country. There's many reasons. It's not really just one thing, right? Parents are having fewer kids or no kids at all. Moving out of the cities. Per pupil funding is usually what districts complain about, that the state isn't giving them enough money. But the Walz administration did give public schools quite a bit of money, maybe not enough to what they wanted, but a lot, comparatively speaking. So is it just one thing when you look at the data and crunch the numbers, or is it just that perfect storm of less students, less per pupil, and then Minneapolis in and of itself operating for a number of students it just doesn't have?
So obviously it's a combination of factors. I think the thing that we have to recognize as well is that Minnesota innovated the idea of school choice, and that is playing a large role here as well. So Minnesota invented the idea of open enrollment, the idea that you could attend districts that were outside the borders of your city. It also invented the idea of charter schools. Charter schools have become the largest siphon of enrollment away from MPS, but other districts are also affecting that as well. And so when we look at this sort of collectively, we have to sort of take all of that into account. What it does is it creates a highly competitive environment for schools and for districts. And so if you're a district, you have to be competing for students. And there are people who say that Minneapolis Public Schools is not exactly doing that. And so, moving forward, I think the question is, first of all, there's going to be a lot of questions around school closures and mergers, whether they could sort of reduce the budget enough to actually make an investment somewhere. And then the question is, can they make an investment that would lure students back? And I spoke to a former superintendent who suggested if they invested in high dosage reading tutoring, for example, and essentially guaranteed that students would be reading at proficient levels by the time they graduate, they might be able to win students back, in part because many charter schools are not delivering these results. And our newspaper had a large investigation last year that was looking just at charter schools.
And when it comes to, because we have covered extensively on KARE 11 at the Star Tribune, you have as well, many school districts are facing some serious budget issues. We're focusing on Minneapolis today, not just to pick on them, but that's just the topic that you wrote on. But when Minneapolis is looking at a $50 million gap, and you point out in your piece the data that says they have 56 school buildings built for 43,000 students and they have 30,000 enrolled, it begs the question that you bring up to that question of merging and or closing schools, which is always an ouch spot. And if you're in the neighborhood where the school closes, But is that really, in your opinion, the practical solution here?
I mean, we've been through this before. In the 1980s, enrollment had dipped for many years, and they had to make a very tough decision to close 18 schools. And at the time, the superintendent said, "We're going to take that money and invest in programs." Now, this was before open enrollment and before charters, but they actually did see continuing enrollment growth after that. But at the same time, there are still people today that will talk to you about those schools that closed, especially the high schools. That's a very big deal. When we think about people who won state championships and tournaments and all of these things, there's a lot of pride still in those schools that are no longer here. So it's a very difficult decision. But when we look at the budget, it's getting to a point where they I think they have to find a way to right size this budget, and they're currently paying for a large campus that is larger. I mean, as their enrollment, the thing we should basically point out here is that the money from the state, which is a large share of the money that schools get, follows the students. So as this enrollment has been dropping, they've been getting less revenue. And at some point, you sort of have to look at this as sort of if you're trying to balance the books, something has to give. They're not doing that right now. So what they're having to do is cut into services, such as the things that are being looked at right now are like school counselors. There's some, there was a meeting the other day where all of these cuts were gone through. People talked about them. But again, that kind of feeds into that doom loop question. Now, I mean, closing schools is also it's a very big thing, and that could have its own effects. But something sort of has to give here. And I think, I'm not someone who had I don't have children. I don't have much experience with the public schools, but as someone who cares a lot about Minneapolis, I think we have to be paying attention to this because great cities have great public school districts. The health of this district is very important to the health of the city overall.
Yeah, you took the question right out of my mouth. For people that don't have kids in the Minneapolis schools, but they care about Minneapolis, they do have, in your opinion, a vested interest in this. It would make sense that they want the public school district to succeed, not just because you like seeing things succeed, but it kind of it gives way to economic growth. It makes a healthy city if you have a healthy school district, and vice versa.
Well, like, for example, we can see in the data that the number of people having children in Minneapolis is falling faster than in Hennepin County or in the state. Now, I wonder, it's hard to exactly know what's going on there, but just anecdotally, we can all maybe imagine people we know who are about to have children and say, okay, well, I'm going to go move to one of the suburbs where there's a better school district. Or you imagine people moving here from somewhere else that are thinking of having children that move not to Minneapolis, but to somewhere else. And so, it's hard to read into sort of what the anecdotes are in that data. But I think, just seeing that the number of they call it the number of births is dropping in Minneapolis faster than in the state or the county, I think that is something to be paying attention to. We want this to be a destination for people to live, and we want it to be a great place to raise a family. And I think the school system is a real question mark to sort of the success of that.
You also pointed out in your column, and many of the people watching this will be able to drum up their own memories of it. We've had some pretty memorable labor fights between the teachers union in Minneapolis and the district, with the teachers saying, we are not settling for less than X. And the teachers have mostly gotten what they've asked for. So the union seems to be healthy and aggressive in saying what it wants. When does the district get to be healthy and aggressive saying what it wants?
I mean, I think the thing that is notable here is that the leader of the teachers union, there was a large strike in 2022. It lasted 3 weeks. And the leader of the teachers union in that strike ran for school board, and she now represents part of Minneapolis on the school board. The teachers union is a very powerful force in this district. And, that's what, I mean, the unions they're working for their members, right? And I'm not saying that they're not working for the school district, but they're advocating as unions do. But I think that what we are coming into here, this tough question around, closures and mergers. The union, I mean, when we talk about closures and mergers, we're really, in a sense, talking about potential layoffs. And so that's going to be a decision that the school board has to make that the union may not be happy with. And so it's just worth understanding the union's influence within the school board, including one of the members being the former president of the union.
Right. I can remember, Eric, right, it was before COVID, perhaps the year before, all the hubbub in Minneapolis was about this great grand redistricting plan that was going to change everything. And it was hotly contested by some, but the district really wanted this redistricting plan, saying this is what's going to save our schools. And then COVID hit. So I don't know if the redistricting plan didn't launch or just didn't work. What do you think?
I didn't cover that directly, but I think that suffice it to say, it seems to have irked a lot of parents. And when you are in a highly competitive environment like this with school choice, that does matter. And a lot of people have left the district, and that takes money with them and their students. And so it seems to me, I mean, I think there is somewhat of an agreement these days that was a bungled restructuring. And now we're moving into the transformation, right? So that is going to be, in a sense, a different type of restructuring. And I think that they need to come up with a plan that has a wider community buy-in. I think that's kind of the sort of center of what they need to be thinking about here, because it doesn't really feel like that's what was happening in that last restructuring.
In 2026, how do you get wide community buy-in in MPS? What do you think?
Are you saying, like, in our current, we can't agree on?
We don't. Yeah, but also it's just so sensitive. When we're talking about schools, people are talking about their kids, and there are things that are it's just the most personal thing you could talk about. And everybody wants the best for their kids. And they think that somebody's out to get them, perhaps. And so how do we get buy-in from the city and from parents and educators and the district of, like, we have to do hard things and agree on what those hard things are?
I mean, I guess, I don't have an easy answer to that. I do think, though, that we need more a spotlight and attention on this. We have a school board that operates a bit on an island from the rest of the political scene in the Twin Cities. Unfortunately, the rest of politics in Minneapolis is very toxic and very sort of divisive and polarized. So it's not exactly like we have a lot of agreement there. But I think at a minimum, I think it would be helpful if politicians at all levels started to really point a spotlight toward this problem that we need to figure out, and actually really emphasize that it is a problem and it is something that we need to do something about. And that may sort of lay the groundwork for, okay, we have to come up with a plan. I'm not saying everyone's going to agree on that plan, but I just think it's a little unfortunate. And I'm somebody who was not paying attention to the school board. I went to my first school board meeting in the course of writing this column. And it seems like, given its importance, it should have a higher profile. In other cities, and I think many people might disagree with this here, but in other cities, the mayor is partly or completely responsible for sort of governance of the schools as far as appointing school board members and things like that. Whether or not that's effective, it does give it a higher profile and a bit more accountability. And I think that, it's also worth pointing out, we have elections this year for Minneapolis School Board. And so, that will raise the profile of this a bit. And I think those are going to sort of happen as we are starting to have the discussion about the transformation. So I don't know I think you're right that it is a very emotional topic. It is, it's hard to get everybody to agree, especially if we're talking about closures and mergers. But at the end of the day, I think everyone is interested in the health of the district, right? Everybody wants to see this thing get on a better footing. And so we are at a very sort of frightening place now, and hopefully that can lead to some really hard decisions and community buy-in about what are we going to invest in if we do save money from these really tough decisions. And that's why that 1980s example is really interesting to me, because it seems like it did have somewhat of an impact. It was before charters and open enrollment, but it was an interesting corollary to what we're looking at today.
I'm sure there's going to be much more to discuss on this topic. I agree with you that we should be focusing more on it. We seem to focus on so many things that don't have like direct impact. And this is the Minneapolis Public School District, where the people of Minneapolis each perhaps could get a say, especially with board members. Eric Roper, thank you for joining us on The Plus tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. That's all for us this week. I'll see you next Monday on Breaking the News Plus.